in all these stories, so we come into a historical era only with Abraham. Before that, nothing is actually historical. And one of the reasons why people tend to set the beginning of Earth itself at about 6,000 BC or so is because that's when writing was invented and became generally used. So that was the beginning of written history of the Earth. Before that, we have some petroglyphs and things like that. But writing itself actually as recording things around 6,000 BC. And first in Chaldea, with the cuneiform writing. And it's interesting that probably writing was invented for business, to keep tracks of who owed you how much money and for what. I mean, at least in Chaldea, most of the records that are left are business transactions. And it was adapted so that the emperor, the king, could send out decrees or laws. But the reason why we started to have systems of law at about that time, like Hammurabi and Chaldea and in other areas, and of course the laws of Moses, because writing had developed to a point where people were using it for everyday use. And so they promulgated systems of law instead of just verbal edicts from the king or something, and cultural law. So the thing of when people were recording this history, either they weren't there and they recorded it later, so they weren't quite clear on what happened, or they simply told it the way they understood it, in a way. And consequently, you can't, if a person says, it was only in North America at the time of I believe the Harvard professors, the 3 Harvard professors, who were teaching religion, who were the first ones, as far as I know, to say that every single word of the Scripture was written by God, which is obviously not true, and that every single word is infallible. And we don't really find that so much in the early church writings, because they understood that, first of all, some of the stories were allegorical, and there were a lot of metaphor, and that before the time of Abraham, you didn't have any concrete history. But in the time of the chroniclers told the story the way they understood it, not necessarily the way it was. And that's why they would say, well, okay, so God punished these people for doing something wrong. But in fact, something else might have happened. And I suspect that a lot of them were killed in rioting that followed, or even driven over the edge into that gorge that was there. And that's why they said the earth swallowed them up, because they were cast into the gorge. It would have been a moment of really confusion and sort of anger, and then a lot of people would have suddenly been seized by their conscience as well for having participated. And some would have participated through fear of the others. So it's not to be taken in a Protestant fashion about it. Because really, if you just notice the dramatic change in the teachings from the time of the judges to the time of the prophets, there's a huge shift in that. And the main difference is that up until the end of the time of the judges and the time of the kings, the Hebrews were just a tribe desperate for survival. And they themselves were a little more savage. It was a very savage era. It was a savage time. And what the Hebrews did was no more savage than what everybody else around them did. But as a small tribe trying to survive, they needed kind of an absolute conformity also. And after the kings, the 2 kings that were of significance, the 2 important kings, David and Solomon, of course, Israel became an actual nation state. And once it was an established nation state, then matters could change. They didn't need the rigidity, they didn't need the absoluteness that they had before. And so the prophets now are concerned about different things, different issues. And of course, from a prophetic point of view, to neglect the widows and the orphans was a kind of idolatry. To neglect the stranger and the people who were in need was a kind of idolatry. So they were very concerned about how you related to other people. And in the time of the prophets, we began to see this very profound interrelationships are really what this is all about. It's how we relate to others. And you can't relate to God without relating to others. And the prophets are talking about this a great deal. In the beginning, of course, the big struggle was to keep people from falling into the particular idolatries around them. And, of course, the prophets had difficulty with that. We still do. I mean, that hasn't vanished. Man, we're inclined toward bits of idolatry in it. And it's so easy to kind of fall into that. And that's one of the difficulties between the Sadducees and the Pharisees in that era of Christ. Because some parts of Israel have become so Hellenized, involved in Hellenic culture and society and everything. Because after Alexandria, a lot of Greek cities were built around. And that's why we talk about Galilee of the Gentiles, where Christ went. A lot of Greeks. And so theater has been opened. And there were, the one thing that would never have existed in Israel would have been the circus. Now, a circus was a place where you fed people to lions and stuff. It wasn't, a three-ring circus like we think about it. Circus just means a circle, and the stadiums and things that really generated quite a lot of violence didn't exist among the Hebrews, but existed in Greek culture. And they were introduced. Herod built a hippodrome, and the Jews actually developed theater. I mean, the Jews had a very dignified theater. There were morality plays, and nobody ever portrayed God or even the voice of God in the plays. But they portrayed stories from the Hebrew Scripture and all. But the thing is, as you go back farther and farther into history, remember that there are several books that we know were written in ancient times that are missing. Because when you read the Chronicles, it'll say, and it's not the rest of the lives of the kings written in the book of Yashar. The book of Yashar has vanished. We have it not at all. So somebody had summarized the stories from, there are I think 3 or 4 vanished books from the Old Testament that are completely, they're referred to in Chronicles and Kings, but we don't have them. So the chroniclers had extracted from them. And the chroniclers, of course, were after the time of Moses. And some of these stories were really written by having been handed down. I think the story of Joshua, perhaps was in the book of Yashar, but we don't have that book anymore. So the stories were retold in a way, and we don't know what the original was in it. But they were retold the way people understood them as chroniclers. And if you read the chroniclers of any place that had chronicles, they always are writing to please their own leaders and to kind of glorify their own leaders. And they're not, strictly speaking, writing history. They're writing their understanding of the history of their own people in a special way. But you find that in any set of chronicles. Herodotus was perhaps the first one to really try to have really concrete and honest history as history, because the concept didn't exist of history. I think Herodotus may have even invented the very concept itself of recording history as such. And so so many stories like that. It's the way the chronicler understood them. It's not what actually transpired. And the way you can really know that is because otherwise there are these radical contradictions in what's said. And we have those contradictions, And there are contradictions between the prophets, who are, of course, a whole different era, and who are speaking really in the Spirit of grace, in the Spirit of God. But the chroniclers weren't necessarily inspired by God. They were just chroniclers. The prophets were, but the chroniclers weren't. The ones who wrote the history of the kings and of the judges weren't necessarily inspired by God in what they wrote. They were just trying to record the traditional history that had come down to them. So you really can't put that in the same context at all as you put the holy prophets in.